For today's topic, we're going to talk about how school systems handle mental health. Alrighty. So this is a really big topic. It could probably go on and on and on. I'm going to do my best to try to stay super focused. I'm not going to encompass every single kind of policy, paradigm, procedure, pedagogy, law that schools and school districts have to follow, because I'm not an expert in school districts. I'm an expert in mental health. So yes. So if there are things that you hear and you're like, there's probably more nuance than that, then you're probably right. It probably is. So shoot us a message, hello@simplypsych.com. And if we get things wrong, we'll try to correct those things. But in general, I'm going to talk in kind of big generalities so that hopefully you can take away some helpful things from this particular part. So most school districts have some type of mandate. So if you go to the school district website, and you read their charter, because they are basically companies that are chartered by cities or counties, just depending on where you live in the country. In Texas, we have a lot of independent school districts they kind of morph across sometimes county lines, or they morph across city lines. In other places, you have consolidated districts. I think in California, they do a lot of that kind of stuff. So anyway, if you want to know what a school district does, go read the charter. But the overall gist of a school district is to take the few finances that you have, the few resources that you have, and then spread them as theoretically, as equitably as possible to the kids that you are charged with educating, and then supporting the teachers and all the administration that goes with running a school. And so when it comes to mental health, there oftentimes is the mental health kind of arm the vein is very kind of thin when it comes to school districts, because school districts aren't, they're meant for education purposes. They weren't built with kind of psychiatrists and therapy in mind. That wasn't the goal. And so over the years, what has happened is the veining of the mental health has kind of morphed, and it gets really interesting. But luckily, it's growing. It's becoming more and more prevalent in the educational setting, which is, I think, a very, very good thing. And so there are, back when I was in school, back when I was younger, a lot of my teachers, they were able to see kiddos, and when they would interact with kids, they would just do what they felt was best. So if Bobby's jumping up and down and being ridiculous, the teacher would bring Bobby closer to her desk, or his or her desk. If Bobby had a really difficult time sharing, and Bobby didn't like to be last in line, there were ways that the teacher could kind of move things around and change up the strategies. Well, that for all intents and purposes, it can be really helpful and very empowering to do so. But if you're not careful, it's a double-edged sword. There are certain times where that can be problematic. For example, if a kiddo was acting up all the time, and again, teachers aren't necessarily trained to know what's going on, but the teacher said, you know what, I'm just going to not force Bobby to do this particular exercise. Well, it could be inadvertently robbing Bobby of a critical thinking skill, or a critical educational component. And so over time, things start to morph into finding ways to better document how you change the expectations for academics. There's a couple of big laws that happened way in the past. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 has a section called 504. And in section 504, it gives school districts the ability to make accommodations for certain types of medical illnesses and a few of the psychiatric concerns, especially ADHD. And then there was the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and the IDEA established special education. And so those two legal precedents exist to be able to make sure that every student has a fair and equitable education, but also to kind of formalize the process if you're going to do any type of changes to the common curriculum. Now, depending on who you talk to and what you read, you may read all sorts of stuff. Oh, people saying that it's not fair, that certain kids can do certain things and other kids aren't required to. I mean, we're not going to get into all of that stuff because I find that type of conversation is unhelpful when speaking in generalities about specific kids, because each kid is so different, y'all. I mean, yeah. And then their circumstances are different. So when I have a kid who's disruptive, it's not always ADHD. Sometimes it's trauma. Sometimes it's poverty. Sometimes it's parents having parental discord or divorce. I mean, it can be all sorts of things. And I get the pleasure of playing nuance in my little office because it's just me and that one kid. Whereas school districts and schools and teachers, they have to juggle thousands of kids all at the same time. And so I'm not bashing schools in the least. What I am saying is that we really need to make sure we understand what they can do and what they have time and resources to do. And so in the school setting, we do our best. Teachers and school districts do their best to try to have people on site who can help. Generally, and again, I'm speaking in Texas, but I want to say I think it's a national thing. Their employees that manage the mental health aspects are called LSSP, so licensed specialists in school psychology. So licensed specialist in school psychology, LSSPs. And they are therapists. They get a master's degree. They do all of their hours of like client work to learn therapy, and that's all that good stuff. But they do it in an educational setting. And so, and then oftentimes underneath LSSPs are what they call diagnosticians. So these are people who also have their master's degrees. But they learn all the psychometrics, which are all of the tests to be able to test for like educational stuff. So reading disorders and writing disorders in writing or disorders in math and that sort of thing. They can also help diagnose things like autism spectrum disorder and stuff like that. And they can do real live observations, like sit in the classroom and observe kids, and also do therapy. And so a lot of school districts will have the LSSP as an employee, the diagnostician as an employee, and then different campuses will have school counselors. And what school counselors are, in general, are teachers who go back and get a counseling degree. So they know how to teach, and then they will go and do 3,000 hours of a master's, get a master's in counseling, and then do their 3,000 hours of casework, and then they can work with kids at school. And so these three layers of the mental health workforce are in the school itself, and then they can connect with people outside of the school. So, general therapists, psychiatrists, so on and so forth. Well, it's really interesting because there's a nuance there's a legal nuance in the world of diagnosing, that most times being able to diagnose, which is like labeling somebody with something, is the realm of the physician. And that's because of how state laws are written. And so a lot of schools will not diagnose people, even though they kind of can. It's very, very confusing. Don't try to figure it out. And so, because it's like a big point of contention. So don't try to figure it out. Just let us handle all that stuff. And so they won't necessarily diagnose the official terms. They use their kind of term. So, for example, in the school setting, you'll hear emotional disturbance, which I would get kids who would get referred to me, and it would say, "Oh, at school they're labeled as emotional disturbance." And I'm like, I don't know what that is. Like, what is that? Well, after talking with folks in school, teachers, colleagues who work in that setting, they were like, well, we know something is up, but we're not allowed to diagnose. So in other words, I can't diagnose ADD. I can't diagnose PTSD. We just know that their behavior in the school setting is problematic. And we're having a very difficult time, and we need to be able to do some interventions. And so that's the working label that they use inside the school district. And then what I do as the person outside the school district is I take that and I go, okay, something's up. And then I try to match it with symptoms and give it a title. And then that allows me to treat it. And then I can use, depending on the setting, I can use what I have learned to send a form or a letter back to the school to say, here are some of the accommodations, or here are some of the exceptions you should give that particular kid so that they can be more successful. It is a super convoluted system. Like, if you are tired just even listening to this answer, just imagine what teachers go through and parents go through and psychiatrists go through. And I'm sure there's an easy way of doing it, but trying to change established paradigms in the education system and the established paradigms of the mental health system, the medical system, it's daunting. And so I don't want y'all to feel overwhelmed in hearing all this ridiculousness. Instead, I want you to feel empowered. So if you're in a school and your kiddo needs something, the first key is take it to whoever your principal or school counselor or assistant principal or vice principal, whatever they call them on your campus. Take it to them and put it in writing. If you don't put it in writing, it did not happen. So put it in writing so that everybody can be on the same page. Once you put it in writing, pretty much most public schools, and again, I'm mainly speaking for public schools. Private schools do their kind of own thing, which we can talk about in a second. But most public schools will then start a process to make sure that what is going on is what is going on. And so they will get the LSSP, licensed specialist in school psychology. They will get that person involved, or a diagnostician, or whoever their designated mental health person is. And then oftentimes they will call what is called an ARD, A-R-D. So it stands for admission, retention, dismissal. And at first, it took me a long time to figure out what that was, because I would hear it all the time. Hey, go do an ARD. And I was like, what does an ARD mean? What is this? And so I sat in on more than my fair share of what these things are. But they're basically team meetings with teachers and school officials and parents, and sometimes even the kid will sit in. And it's an opportunity to basically share information between these different folks so that we're all speaking on the same page, so that by the end of the ARD meeting, we will know where we're going, what interventions we're doing, how we will know if the interventions were successful, what to do if the interventions aren't successful, who's taking responsibility for what thing in the plan. Like, it's very thorough. And so that's the first ARD. They start the interventions. At some point, you will have a follow-up ARD meeting. And if they need to retain you underneath that structure, that's where the R comes from. Or if things are better and they need to dismiss you from those accommodations, that's where the D comes from, right? So that process, depending on the kids, sometimes the ARD follows the whole entire school year, and then they'll do a new one at the next academic year. Just kind of depends. But yeah, so that's kind of how that process works, to try and incorporate and be more supportive of mental health in the educational space. My wish and goal would be that things are more integrated and more streamlined, because there are lots of therapists, as you can imagine, trying to do therapy during the school day while you're, doing 8 classes, and you're, 10 minutes or 5 minutes between classes, and you're doing lunch, and that can be really stressful. And I don't know how you fit therapy into doing that. And so most times kids do their therapy outside of the school day, or sometimes they have to miss school. And it would be great at some point to have therapy more integrated in the actual school day itself. So that's a dream of mine. Where I trained in Kentucky, we actually had school-based clinics. So as a child psychiatrist, they literally were in the school. So I would go once a month and every other week to a school and just sit there, and the parents would come up, and we would do all our appointments like a standard old psychiatry appointment at the school. And the kid would just walk down the hallway, see me, I'd talk with the parents, send the kid back to class, voila. And it made so much sense, and it was awesome, and I loved it. And they may be doing things similar in Texas. I don't know. We tend to be kind of further behind than we should be, but it's a place of great promise and great growth if we wanted to incorporate more mental health into the educational space.